It is 10:02, so we'll go ahead and get started. And once again, good morning, afternoon, evening, or night, depending on where in the world you are. It's amazing to see people from all over. My name is Beth Sanders, and I'm the Vice Chair of the Registrar's Committee Western Region. And we're so happy to have you here for another webinar in our series, Hands-On Practical Conservation for the Collections Professional. Today's sponsor is US Art. US Art is the largest fine art handler domestically and throughout the world. As a third-generation family business, US Art's commitment to the safe transportation of artwork is unparalleled. With locations across the United States, including both Portland and Los Angeles here in the Western region, be sure to contact US Art for your upcoming projects. And a big thank you to US Art for being a Tier 1 sponsor of RCWR. If you're not a member of RCWR, please consider joining today. RCWR represents collections professionals and registrars in our 9 Western states. In addition to wonderful webinar series like we've been bringing you for the last 15 months, it's been a long time we've been going at this, but we also send out our weekly job listings email, our quarterly newsletter, and have stipends available to apply for conferences. Lindsay, our chair, has just dropped the link, rcwr.org, into the chat. And membership is only $15 a year. So whether or not you're in our region, you're welcome to be a member of our organization. We are happy to have all of our collections professionals, and we invite you to learn more at rcwr.org. Before I introduce today's wonderful speaker, just a few quick reminders. This is a webinar, so while you can see Fran and myself, we can't see you. I hope you're comfortable with your coffee or cocktail, depending on the hour and at your home. It's great to see people using the chat to introduce yourselves. And if you have comments during today's presentation where you want to talk to one another or directly to one of the panelists, you can put those in there. But if you have questions for Fran, for our speaker today, please do put those in the Q&A feature rather than the chat. It keeps all the questions together so that we can get to them at the end of the presentation. And for those of you that did put questions in ahead of time when registering for today's presentation, those have been shared with Fran, except for some of the very last ones that may have come in the last day. But there were a lot of questions. So while she's going to get to some of them, if you don't have your question answered during today's presentation, we can either put it in the Q&A feature here, or you'll have our email addresses, or really more importantly, Fran's email address up on the screen later today. And she's willing to speak more about specific topics we can't get to via email. The other thing about today's webinar is you may have noticed we are recording this morning. So this webinar, as well as all of our other webinars for this series, are up on our RCWR YouTube page. So this one will go up in about 3 days, and a link has just been put to our YouTube page in the chat. So don't forget to subscribe so you'll get all those notifications easy to see, but you can always reference back there or to our website, rcwr.org, and look at the workshops tab where you can see the listing of our past events with the YouTube videos embedded. Today, we are very fortunate to have Fran Ritchie here with us. Fran is an objects conservator for the National Park Service's Harpers Ferry Center. Fran works on a wide variety of decorative arts, social history, and natural history collections across park sites. Prior to working with the Park Service, she developed a specialty in natural history conservation by working with the American Museum of Natural History. Personally, that was like the museum of my childhood, the Draper Museum of Natural History, and several small and private collections across the United States. Fran has co-taught graduate student courses on conservation and natural science collections at New York University, and guest lectured on the topic at Buffalo State College. She's a professional associate of the American Institute for Conservation and is an active member of the Society for Preservation of Natural History Collections. Thank you so much to Fran for joining us today. With that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and mute myself and turn it over to you.
Yep, sounds great. Thanks, Beth. Okay. Oh my goodness. Okay, so much to cover today. Right away, you can see my email on this first page, so do keep that in mind. I know that conservators have a reputation for always saying no to things, and I think maybe sometimes not sharing enough knowledge. And so I want to stick up for that a little bit by saying, you know, I don't know my audience here. I don't know exactly what your collections are, if they're historic or if they're new taxidermy mounts. So I'm going to share with you as much as I can without knowing any of that information. So give you a really good kind of overview of what to expect when you're caring for and especially cleaning taxidermy. I find that people who are even conservators, if they don't work on these types of materials, they just find them very mysterious. And I think the general population feels that way as well. Not everybody knows how taxidermy is made. Even my cousin, who hunts a lot and has taxidermy mounts of some of his animals, he doesn't know how it's made. So I'm here to kind of like let you peek behind the curtain on that and understand a little bit more about how it's made and then how it deteriorates, so that when you do go to clean them, you'll understand where you need to be careful and hopefully, you know, the point when you really should call a conservator, or at the very least, snap some photos of your issue and email them to me and then ask me for some further guidance. So today we'll do a general taxidermy background, talking about my favorite topic. I don't know if I'm allowed to say as a conservator that I have an absolute favorite material, especially as an objects conservator, because it's such a umbrella term. And for the National Park Service, I work on such a wide variety of things. But it's true, I just really love taxidermy. I'm very drawn to it and those types of collections. And the information I'm sharing with you today will also be procedures that you could use at home on your own taxidermy. So we'll go over the hazards, how to manage them, what are the issues that you should be looking out for before you start to clean them, how to clean them, and then of course, preventive measures so that you can kind of prevent having to call a conservator in the first place. So general taxidermy background. Every taxidermy talk has to start with this. What is taxidermy? It comes from the words taxis, meaning arrangement, and derma, meaning skin. So when you really think about exactly what a piece of taxidermy is, it must have preserved skin. So that skin from the animal has been preserved in some way so that it won't rot. It has to have an internal support, which I'm going to refer to as a mannequin. And it must be posed in a lifelike pose. And the more successful those three things are, the better the piece of taxidermy. These are some examples from the World Taxidermy Championship. And so you can see that I'm talking about full body mounts like the one on the left, as well as shoulder mounts like the one on the right. So it could still be in a lifelike pose, but only be half the animal to count as taxidermy. So throwing around some of these basic taxidermy terms, just so you get an idea for how you should talk about them. These are shoulder mounts or trophy mounts. And in the moose example, you can see that's also attached to a wooden panel on the back. But in the example on the right, we see the back side of it, and that is not attached to an additional panel. And you can see how it does have a piece of wood there, and the skin, the hide has been wrapped around it and then nailed into place. And there's some hardware for it to hang on the wall. We also have full body mounts, and we come across those sometimes in habitat bases, which are bases that the taxidermy is attached to, and it has some kind of vegetal material or has been built up in a certain way to represent the specimen's habitat. And sometimes that's a little bit more accurate than other times, depending on the taxidermist. Or you'll see, especially in older collections, these plain wooden display bases, as the Kingfisher example on the right. And that can just be kind of really classic. I like that aesthetic a lot. But sometimes in collections, whenever I see display bases like that, it signals that it's a really old collection. And by old, I mean prior to the 1900s, which is really great that that organic material will last that long. Then we also have full body mounts within dioramas. And these are my favorite art forms. This is the famous bison display at the American Museum of Natural History in their Hall of North American Mammals. And for something to be considered a diorama, there must be a background painting, and then that ties in to the foreground materials, which often is vegetable material that represents the habitat, as well as the taxidermy specimens. And the examples at the American Museum of Natural History are, in my opinion, my very biased opinion, the best in the world. They depict a certain place geographically at a certain time of day and time of year. And a lot of those were constructed when they went out into those sites and even, did sketches and collected material while they were out there to represent that exact moment. So the bison are in the middle of summer at the height of the day. And sometimes these full body mounts, when they're in dioramas, they're in there, they've been kind of built into that foreground material and you wouldn't be able to remove them. But then other specimens, maybe you are able to remove them. And this little pelican chick is from the Fishing Bridge Museum at Yellowstone National Park. And it was removed from one of the cases. When a display doesn't have a background painting, I'm more apt to call it a life group. So there's some, vegetal material, some habitat material, but there's a few of the specimens together. And so that's what this pelican was removed from. And the metal wires are part of the internal mount that you'll see in later slides. And so when you remove it, you have to put those wires into something. And so we see this pelican chick in a piece of epitherm. So keep that in mind. All right, even more on how it's made. So for taxidermy, like I said, it's a preserved skin that is then mounted over an internal support or a mannequin. And the techniques have changed throughout history on how people have created the mannequins. And the first two examples that you see on this timeline were not very good. It's carved solid wooden forms. And then after that, they just stuffed them to smithereens. You'll see that walrus. It's my favorite example. It's at the Horniman Museum in the UK. And at the time, the taxidermists had not seen a walrus before, and someone brought it back from an expedition. So they didn't realize that walruses are supposed to have folds in their skin. So this taxidermist just literally stuffed it like a teddy bear until the skin couldn't stretch anymore. So very interesting example, definitely not a good one. That does not represent a species accurately. So then taxidermists came up with the binding and wrapping method and a few other methods that we still see today that still create really good mounts. So we'll focus on those final three techniques. But right before that, I want to say, since the skin preparation is really important, what you do with the skin, you take it off the animal and you have minimal incisions because the less incisions you make, that means the less seams that there are going to be and the less sewing you'll have. It makes it more realistic if you don't have to worry about sewing seams everywhere. So you take off the hide in one big piece, as big as possible, and you want to prepare it so that it doesn't putrefy, so it doesn't rot. You want to dry it out, and that prevents feather loss and hair loss. And it also helps prevent pest damage if you're able to scrape off all of the fat, connective tissue, and muscle that's left on that hide. So you're going to scrape all that off, you're going to wash it, and you're going to pickle it or degrease it using various means. And then you'll apply a preservative or a tanning agent. And those can be a huge range of things. Some thinner skins today, you just use borax to dry it out on the insides. A lot of birds are prepared that way, or small mammals. Back in the day when they were still applying arsenic soap and other types of chemicals, they would use a chemical preservative. But taxidermy today is usually, I'd say, alum tod or some other kind of a mineral tan or like a chrome tan or even vegetable tan. So usually, especially if it's a larger animal, they're going to be tanned. And sometimes that's very proprietary. And then they're going to be applied over top of the mannequin. So forming that mannequin, the binding and wrapping method seems kind of funky, but it's actually really successful. You start with forming an internal mount, internal frame, maybe I should say. And you can see in that historic drawing there in front of you that that's kind of, there's a little bit of bone in there, there's some wood, there's some metal components, and then the legs on that example have started to be padded out by taking loose binding material. It's really thin slivers of wood. And sometimes it's referred to as wood wool, sometimes it's referred to as excelsior, and there are a couple different ways, a couple different things that it's been called over the years. And this was a ubiquitous museum material, I think, in the 20th century and early 21st century, or sorry, in the like turn of the century, I should say, 1900. And I think I've seen it in a lot of different places, like filling baskets or filling ceramics. It seemed to be a padding material that just was kind of always around, because this was the time period before having foams. And I liken it to the green grass that you see in Easter baskets. It's kind of like that, but it's made out of wood. So another organic material that's in there that's, you know, known for off-gassing. Usually as a conservator, I would say don't use wood. So it's interesting that like you fill an organic material with organic material. But anyway, you clump it together and then you bind it using string. And you can add some more in some areas and build that up to be, you know, where the muscle bulges out, or take away from some areas and bind that up to make it a little bit more concave. And if you're really good at it, you can actually create a very realistic mannequin that mimics all the muscles from the original specimen. So other examples that you see on the screen in the bottom left corner, that's the carcass of a bird. And then right above it is the bound mannequin that the taxidermist made based off of the measurements from the carcass. And the results of these, like I said, they can create really good visuals, but they can be heavy, they can be dense, and usually there's a lot of different components inside the mannequin that can be all responding to the environment in different ways and can cause some issues with condition. Then there was kind of the renaissance of taxidermy, and it was a hollow casting technique. This is often attributed to Carl Akeley, but he wasn't the only person who thought of it. So you start by sculpting the animal. You once again use the measurements from the actual carcass of the animal. You might use some bones and whatnot in your sculpture just to make sure that you get everything precise. And then you make a lifelike form of that sculpture. And then you make a mold out of it. And then inside the mold, you can cast your mannequin using traditionally paper mache, quote unquote, you know, it's like strips of burlap and plaster or various materials. And you just line the inside of your mold with that. And then you get the two halves. You can pry them out and put them together. So you see that in images 4 and 5, putting the two pieces together, putting the finishing materials on it. You might not be able to tell, but the tail is still a metal wire, even though the rest of it is this other type of material. And then in the final image, on image 6, you see them actually mounting the preserved hide over top of this mannequin. And this is a really good example of showing you, you'll notice that I don't refer to taxidermy as stuffed objects. I refer to them as taxidermy mounts. And we say that because the hide is mounted onto the mannequin. So don't call it stuffed unless you want to offend a taxidermist. And then today, once polyurethane foam came into production, that's what a lot of mannequins are made of today. You can buy these, they're commercially produced for all of the animals that are game animals. So you see, or game or like pest animals or anything that is legal for people to harvest and legal for taxidermists to mount. And so what happens that they'll have a another, you know, kind of they build their own, like the original person, you know, builds that form. They build that form of the beaver, and then they make a mold out of that. And inside the mold, that's when they can inject the polyurethane foam, and it fills up inside. And then you take it out, and you have this this mannequin. And if you need to, you know, if your exact specimen isn't quite the same shape as this, you know, standardized one, then you can take a knife and you can cut away and trim on some sides, or you can build up areas using modeling clay or various materials to fit your exact specimen. So this is really nice. And not only are they prefabricated, but also, you know, taxidermists can make them themselves. So if they're doing a specimen that they got from the zoo, like an orangutan that, you know, wasn't killed, it was, you know, it died of natural causes and then was donated to a museum. If the museum wants to mount it, the taxidermist can either do, you know, some of the binding materials and whatnot, or they might take their own mold that they make and make a polyurethane mannequin out of it. But polyurethane is not an archival foam. So I am a little nervous on how these are going to deteriorate over time. And what I'm personally am going to be seeing in about 30 to 40 years, there's a good chance that if it wasn't mixed properly, then it might really deteriorate and kind of fall in on itself. So time will tell. And this is just a really great image that I came across in a museum. You can see the binding method on the left, and then the foam method in the middle, and then the final taxidermy mount. And you'll see some other things too, like even in the binding method, they use that wood wool in the set for the torso, but then on the arms and legs, they use cotton batting that they wound up, and both of them use just a wire for the tail. The real skull is in the bound method, but in the polyurethane foam, it's just part of the foam mount. But both of them have modeling clay and then eyes that have been set into the clay. And these are the interesting looking finishing materials. When a taxidermy mount is finished, that would be doing things like painting areas where when the animal was living, it would still have color, but then once it dies, that color goes away. So you see a lot of paint on birds around their faces and especially on their feet, but even on animals, on mammals as well. And then you can buy different types of eyes. They could be made out of plastic or glass. These are tongues that you see. Those are ear liners for, I keep wanting to say jackalopes, but ear liners that we see, some jaw sets in the corner. So those are plastic jaws instead of using the real teeth, because teeth really dry out and crack and delaminate over time, and there can be a lot of loss. So sometimes a taxidermist will just choose to use plastic. And it's kind of difficult sometimes to clean the skull well enough. So using plastic can be better for that. So I know that everyone's aware of the hazards. There were a lot of questions on what to do about arsenic. And I'm sorry, I didn't get a chance to listen ahead of time. I meant to about the hazardous talk that you all had before this one. So if I am overlapping with some of that, that's okay. But sorry if people are like, yeah, we already know all this. All right, so arsenic soap. It was a game changer for the field of taxidermy when it was first discovered and used. And that's because, they didn't have things like IPM programs back in that day. And poisoning things was kind of the best way to protect these materials that are sensitive to pest damage. The first written account that I know of was written 1803, 1804, but it wasn't just for natural history collection. So if people don't know this, it's really interesting because women and men used to ingest arsenic kind of for youth and beauty back in the Victorian era. And arsenic was also used in the textile, wallpaper, and artificial flower industry as dye and in pigment form. So it was not just affecting taxidermists, it was affecting other industries as well. And you can see in that historic illustration on the bottom of the page, those hands, and that's from an artificial flower making it's an artificial flower maker, the person's hands, and you can just see all of the sores and different things that are happening because of the exposure to arsenic. That will not happen to you. You all are not applying the arsenic, or if you were thinking about doing it, don't do it. So this is not the concern for these types of collections and for other organic collections that have residual pesticides on them, especially unfortunately Native American collections and other things. For taxidermy, the arsenic soap, it was mixed into a paste and it was applied to the inside of the skins before mounting it onto the form. So in a way, you have this like nice contained little toxic nugget. And it does eventually, arsenic is a heavy metal. So if it comes, it's going to eventually work its way because of gravity and because of the skin deteriorating over time and shifting around on the mannequin. Those particulates, which are white or gray in color, they're going to work their way out of the seams. So a lot of times if you do see arsenic coming out, you'll see it coming from the seams on the torso or around the eyes or around the beaks or mouth or any places where it's not quite sealed as much. And once again, if it does start to migrate out, then it's going to fall to the ground, to the base of the taxidermy. So as long as you're not going in there and like rubbing your face in there or licking the taxidermy mounts, I don't want you to think that, just by looking at a piece of taxidermy or having it in your room, that you're automatically going to become sick from arsenic poisoning. That's just not the case unless you are shaking it over your head and licking it. But we do know that it is, it's poisonous to pests and humans. So it's a skin irritant and it's carcinogenic. So one thing, you're going to know if you get it on your hands, or if you get it under your fingernail, or if it's on your skin, you're going to develop like a little rash there. So, and that having, one little particulate of arsenic on your skin, you're going to notice it, and then you're going to, amend whatever you're doing. You're going to stop handling the taxidermy. You're going to put on better PPE, and you'll be able to go on with your job. I just really feel like people are scared of taxidermy because they might not really understand it if they're not as enamored by taxidermy as I am. And so the fact, like, it's something that they're already a little weary about, and then the fact that it has pesticides in it just makes them extra weary. And then people are more apt to not take care of them as they should, or more apt to get rid of them, or different things. And I just don't want to see that happen. I think that we can really manage this. And it would just be such a shame if these specimens, they were collected at one point and someone took the time and care to mount them and preserve them in perpetuity. And I just don't want their lives to end because we're scared of them. So other notable pesticides that people should be worried about, not scared, but worried about in a healthy way, are actually vapor-based pesticides that were also applied to organic collections. And there's a conservagram pamphlet that was put out by the National Park Service back in 2001, and it gives a really good overview of different pesticides that were used on national park collections. So if you're unfamiliar with these types of hazards, that's a really great thing to see, because then you'll know, what to look out for and be more aware of what you're seeing and hearing. So other ones, mercuric chloride was also very popular to put onto taxidermy specimens and herbarium specimens. So that's a really big one in herbarium. And I'd say that that arsenic and mercury are the two things that I look for the most when I am surveying a taxidermy collection. We also have paradichlorobenzene and naphthalene, which are mothballs, and then a variety of other things that were used, but those are the main ones. How do you know? A good thing to do if you haven't done it already is to research the history of use in your own museum. So consult your museum records, ask long-term staff, and then make sure that you record what they say for other folks to know in the future. Ask people who have already retired. Look around old storerooms. Kind of weird, but sometimes places will still have the old containers of things, back in the back, in the very back of the janitor's closet or something, where they have other types of poisons for different things. Like before a robust IPM program, the poisons were all back there. So see if there's, especially the vapor-based ones, where people were going in and using fumigants. Let's see, visually inspect your specimens and the storerooms. So you want to look for white particulates on the mounts. But know that if you see a white particulate on a taxidermy mount, that does not always mean that it's a pesticide. It could be borax, it could be corn cob pieces that were used to dry out the skin before it was made into a taxidermy mount, or even a variety of other things. I've seen white particulates on mounts before and been like, ooh, let me flag that. And then when I do XRF on it, I don't find any traces of arsenic. And I'll even do it, right on that sample. So you never know, but it's always a place to start. If you do see something like that, definitely flag it. Look for blocks or containers of unknown substances. Also note particular smells. Sometimes when I go into historic collections, if they are wooden collection or housing units, or if the trays are wood and the museum has been using those for decades, then chances are that room is going to smell. It has a particular smell from different fumigants. And even though they might not be applied on a regular basis, that will stay in the wood. It will stay in that room. It's just absorbed in the walls, and just will kind of always be there, unfortunately. And then also, like I was saying, be conscious of any skin irritation. So just be very aware of your body. If you don't have someone in-house who can do analysis, you can collect samples and submit them to a third party for analysis. You can hire a third party to come in and conduct air quality testing to make sure that those things aren't kind of flowing around in the room, especially if you do have a lot of vapor-based pesticides. And then you can also perform tests for arsenic and other heavy metals, which I'll say in a second. So these are interesting. Like there's an old container of arsenic that was in a collection that actually wasn't natural history, but it was a social history. And that was left over from health and beauty. Take this arsenic. And then the image on the bottom left is some white residue and a taxidermied ear. And then the two examples on the right are ones that I took in collections just within the past 5 years. So there's an old container of paradichlorobenzene in a taxidermy collection storage space that had been kind of neglected for years and years and years and years. And then also suspicious, I can't remember what the actual pesticide is, but that little blue block that you see in the yellow box is some kind of pesticide that was, yeah, in a modern museum collection. For arsenic testing, there's a variety of ways you can go about testing for it. You can use X radiographs, but who has that? We don't even have that here, but in grad school we did, so I've seen what that looks like. You can do chemical spot testing, which I have executed in a couple different labs around the country, but it requires pretty intense chemicals, and you really need to have like a fully equipped chemistry lab to be able to do that. So XRF is the easiest and very, very fast way to detect arsenic, mercury, lead, lots of other things. And so if you're able to have anyone in your area who could come in and bring their XRF, it only takes 12 seconds on the reading on my XRF to be able to see if something's there or not. And I'll usually, if I get a negative, then I'll do a couple more spots around the taxidermy animal. You can see in the picture with this tiger, I was doing the XRF on the head, going around places where the skin's a little thinner, where there might be more concentration of arsenic, but you always do a couple different points just in case in that one spot where you tested, there just so happens to like not be very much arsenic there, but somewhere else there will be. So you always test in multiple places. And there are also at-home water kits. So you can test for arsenic in your water, and people have converted those and used those for testing specimens as well. And I was talking to Shenandoah National Park, and they performed, they used that, the at-home water kits and adapted that for their use, but it just took forever. So they did 12 specimens, and I was able to come in and confirm with my XRF that every time they got a positive result, that was right. And then there was one occasion where they got a negative result, but using the XRF, I actually found that there was some arsenic in there. So it's not always 100% accurate, and depends on if, once again, if you're able to actually get a little bit of arsenic in that sample, because you don't always see it. Sometimes it's just a little teeny tiny bit of residue. So I'm not in this program today necessarily telling you how, step by step, how to go about using these at-home water testing kits, because I still need to do a little bit more research myself on how to really show people how to do that. But if you're interested in doing that in your collection, email me and we can discuss it further. But the best thing to do is to assume that pesticides are just always present. So just wear your PPE, wear your personal protective equipment, and you don't necessarily have to exactly 100% find everything in every object. Just assume that it's there, and wear non-cotton gloves, because you want to have that physical barrier, because the arsenic, since it's the skin, you're not going to be ingesting it. You're not really going to be inhaling it unless some, big gust of wind comes up. So you want that physical barrier. To help without, to help that you don't inhale it, you're going to wear a particle mask. Especially today, now that I'm giving these lectures in COVID times, everybody has one now. And if I don't usually, because I want that physical barrier, I don't usually wear a respirator on objects, on taxidermy objects, unless I'm in a confined space. So if I'm having to crawl into a display case and clean specimens in there or move them around, that's when I'm going to wear my respirator, because I don't know, like, I'm going to be in weird positions and things are going to be kicked up and moved around. The air is going to be moving around, and things might fall in places where they normally wouldn't if you're just very controlled moving your taxidermy around. Especially if I'm also working in a space that I know has a vapor-based pesticide, that's when I'm going to wear my respirator as well, and wear one with the appropriate cartridges. With Tyvek suits, I don't usually wear those as well. I only do, once again, if I'm crawling around in an enclosed space that is known to have a lot of residual pesticides. I will most likely just be wearing a lab coat or some kind of outer covering, so that when I'm done working, I can take that off, take off my gloves, wash my hands, and then go away to lunch and not have to worry about touching a different part, like touching my lap and then eating. I don't have to worry about taking particulates from like one part of my body to another if I take off my lab coat. Another big thing to do is that you want to label the specimens that test positive for pesticides, just, a little hazard label like you see on the slide. And, you say like, warning, pesticide present, if you know the exactly what it is, arsenic or mercury or whatever. Label the collection storage space so that anyone walking into that area will know, or if it's just one designated cabinet that has that material in there, then label that. And you also want to maintain your records. Anytime you've done pesticide testing, and the results, so that future staff will know too. So once you're gone, people will know. And a big thing that doesn't always happen is inform staff and visitors and volunteers of that area of the risks that are involved, especially pregnant women. And to protect yourself, like I'm saying, wear your PPE, limit the working time in those spaces. This is mostly for vapor-based. I've worked in collections, not taxidermy. It was a collection of Native American objects, a lot of organic things. And we would only work, I was doing a condition survey, we would only work for 2 hours every day, because being in that space for more than 2 hours in the past had caused headaches for different collection staff. If you are treating, if you're vacuuming or treating, and that was a whole like collection space too. That wasn't just like one specimen or one object, I should say. If you are treating an object that has mercuric chloride on it or some other vapor-based one, then you just want to make sure that you would treat it in a well-ventilated space or maybe under a fume hood. If you're going to be treating a collection of them or photographing them, maybe don't pull in the whole collection in your space at once. Just bring in a few at a time so that you don't risk, meeting that that threshold limit of having that that chemical around. You want to clean everything that we're talking about today with a HEPA vacuum. I'm assuming in the museum world, you all know what that is. And HEPA vacuums are great because they don't have exhaust coming out of them, so they're not going to be blasting out the arsenic, to the rest of the room. It's very contained. If you don't have a HEPA vacuum, that's okay. Just maybe, if you have some year-end money or something, see if you can invest in one. You want to use designated tools that you store in enclosed containers to prevent cross-contamination. So the brushes that you use for cleaning taxidermy, bag those up or put them in well-sealed container and have those, mark them very well so everyone knows, and use those every time. And then you want to cover your surfaces with plastic sheeting and vacuum everything after use. And then if you have, if you're displaying taxidermy that has residual pesticides on it, or if you suspect as much because of the age of the taxidermy, then you just want to make sure that you don't use those for hands-on programs, and you want to store them in enclosed cases or just well outside of public reach. And in one of the museums I worked for, there were really iconic pieces of taxidermy that were out on open display, and given the nature of like how old things were, we kind of figured that they had some arsenic in them. But I think it's such a small risk for the public to be reaching up on them and having like one little piece of arsenic that would then affect them. Like, I think there's probably more arsenic in drinking waters than what someone would be exposed to that. But you just don't want to risk it. So you want to keep the taxidermy well away from hands. And then for labeling your workspaces, I have a great intern who helped with this one and pointed out some things. So we were working in a temporary lab on some taxidermy that we suspected had arsenic. So she printed out these signs, but anyone walking into that space knew what was going on in there and knew that there was a risk in the area. And you can see in this image that the tables are covered first with plastic sheeting and then with craft paper. So we could throw away the craft paper at the end of each day or whenever we needed to if it got really dirty. And then at the end of the project is when we cleaned off the plastic sheeting and then rolled that up and kind of saved that for another time in a designated bag labeled that it's for use with arsenic specimens. All right, the condition issues that you need to look out for. The main thing that we're talking about today is dust, which seems innocuous. I know, it's like, okay, we're just dusting. Like, no, dust is actually, can be pretty harmful to a collection piece. And it's really important to keep things clean, to keep them free of dust. So dust can actually be a wide variety of things. It can be your dried skin cells, to even coal dust for, depending on where you're located, or the old heating systems and really old buildings. It could be, other air pollutants. And because it can be a variety of things, it can be abrasive. The really small particles of it can actually kind of scratch the surfaces and break hairs and break down on glass eyes or plastic eyes. They can be oily. And then dust can also be, it's hygroscopic. So it attracts moisture on kind of like a micro level. And, we don't want fluctuations in temperature or relative humidity. So we don't want to create these like micro environments on your organic specimen. And then not only that, but the accumulation of dust can also detract from the perceived vitality of the specimen. And by what I mean by that is it makes it look bad. So you see in this image, there's that overall haze on this doll sheep, and it gives it the impression that it's in poor condition. And it also makes it look like it's been neglected. So that reflects poorly on your institution. And I think this is one of the many reasons why taxidermy also kind of gets like a bad reputation, because like if it's a collection that's been a little bit ignored, it's up on the wall somewhere and people haven't really noticed it for a while and they haven't cleaned it, it starts to look bad because of the dirt and because of the dust. So yeah, it just contributes to people then like not really wanting to take care of your, take care of the collection. So, oh yeah, and the dust, depending on what it is, if it's sooty dust, it can alter the color of the specimen, which is bad because then it doesn't represent its actual species. And you don't want a huge accumulation of dust because then you might have to do more thorough cleaning, and that just introduces more risk. There are other issues though besides dust, and these condition issues are what you should be aware of before you start cleaning a piece of taxidermy. So there can be loose or unstable components that can detach or kind of crumple while you're working on something if you use too hard of a touch. So you really want to be gentle when you're handling specimens, especially really old specimens, because that is some really thin, dried out skin that we're just happy exists in this day and age. So in the image on the left, you can see the bird and its head popped off. So you can see the internal mannequin is a metal wire with interesting, they used cotton batting for the actual like head cavity for the skull, but then the body of it is that wood wool or sisal or that loose material that's been bound together. And then the other bird, it's the internal metal wires that are in the legs. This got crushed at some point and those metal wires weren't really strong enough to withstand that. And so now it's leaning off to the side and it just doesn't look good. So be careful when you're touching taxidermy pieces. There could also be loose and unstable components that can detach or just come off while you're working. So when you're dusting an object, you need to really watch what you're doing the entire time. Things like those finishing materials that I was talking about, the paint and the tinted wax that's often on the faces of animals can oftentimes loosens over time, it cracks, it might become brittle depending on what it is, and you just never really know. So treat those areas, especially treat faces with trepidation, because there could be some loose components that you don't realize at first, and then as you're brushing them, they detach. On this armadillo, you can see the left nostril is still intact, the pink kind of hole there, but then the rest of the tinted wax loosened over time and is now lost. And so there's a weird kind of big hole on the end of the nose. And then the primate in the picture on the right, you can see kind of blurry in the back of the photo is its tongue. It's a tinted wax tongue that has fallen out. And then you risk disassociation and you risk losing that over time. So you don't want to bump anything. There could also be loose and unstable components because of pest damage. So you see a mammal on the left that has extensive moth damage. And so all these hairs are coming out. And for that one, unfortunately, our protocol for that was always just to go ahead and vacuum up all of that away because it looks like a mess right there. And by vacuuming all of the signs of pest damage, then you are able to know what's new. So after I vacuumed this one, I could see, you know, the lines where they had been chomping on the hair, but at least it did add back some sheen to it. Even though there were areas of loss, it definitely looked better than it does now. And now we'll know that if we see any more loose hairs in the future, it's because, uh-oh, we have another infestation. On the bird example on the right, the feathers have fallen out and they're on the base of that because of pest damage, because they've been chomping at the base of it and then they just detached. And I also want to say, I know the rule of thumb is that if a piece of taxidermy is old and it looks good, then chances are very high that you have a residual pesticide on it. But that's there can also be animals or specimens that have pest damage that also have pesticides on them. So sometimes, depending on what's going on, the pests are able to eat them and also like do some serious damage before they die off themselves. I've opened drawers before and all that was left were like a couple little feathers, and before it had been a bunch of study skins. So there was like complete annihilation of that collection from those critters. For mammals, it's especially fragile. The thin skin is fragile around the ears. You see a lot of damage there. For this ringtail, the ears didn't have an ear liner in them. So the very tips got crushed at some point and required conservation treatment to bring them back up. But also, even if they do have ear liners, a lot of times the skin will split around the ear liner, because an ear liner is a rigid piece that they put into the ear to keep them erect. And so sometimes as the skin warps over time and dries out over time, it dries around that really stiff material and then ends up cracking and splitting along the edges. Tails are also very susceptible to loss, as you see in the image on the left. When you insert the metal wire, you don't necessarily want to insert that wire all the way out the tip of the tail. You want to stop just before the end. And so that creates a point of weakness, because that little bitty tip of the tail, the little bit of skin that's left in there, that's going to be very susceptible to damage. If the tip of the tail gets bumped, then there's a high chance that it's going to break off. And you see that a lot. So be wary of that. The skin, especially on reptiles, is very thin and fragile. You don't see reptile and amphibian taxidermy, like not nearly as much as mammals and birds. And well, I always thought, oh, it's because their skin is like difficult to taxidermy and it's really thin and it's hard to make realistic, but it's also probably because not that many people really want taxidermy snakes. I do, but not everybody does. But you can see in these examples how fragile that skin can be. The cobra on the left, there's lots of splits in that. The skin was not fully tanned, because when you tan snake skin and fish skin and amphibian, the final result doesn't look realistic, as if the animal were living anymore. So oftentimes these mounts are not tanned, and they're just preserved in different ways, and that makes them even more susceptible to damage. So like you can see the frog in the center, it's that white line that you see going throughout it, that's a plaster mannequin. So once again, like the internal support was too heavy, too rigid for the thin skin that was mounted over top of it. And over time, as that dried, it just it was way too much pressure. It got too small for it and eventually like ripped along the seams and then caused further damage. So if you are working on pieces, if you're cleaning pieces and you're brushing them and vacuuming them, you need to really inspect the skin and look for areas like this where you could potentially snag it and then cause the rip to go even farther, to make it even bigger, to damage it further. So you really want to make sure you look at your taxidermy. You can see the rattlesnake, the tip of the tail has been damaged by pests. And so the rattle has some pieces that are kind of peeling off of it. Fish taxidermy is also tricky. If it is the real fish, oftentimes real as in like it's the real skin, it'll be applied over a pretty rigid form as well. So you see a lot of cracking going on, and then it's painted. So there could be some funky issues on that. Sometimes though, especially these days, it's mostly fish replica. You don't really use the original skin. And so those are easier to manage and take care of, but you want to inspect it and see. These fish examples, the one on the left, the paint that they applied over the original skin is probably a little bit oily. And so over time, that caused the paint to kind of flake off and pop off. So I would be very hesitant. I would not want to vacuum around that area, because chances are pretty high that you're going to end up brushing off a lot of those loose paint flakes and make it look even worse. And sometimes for fish and other of these reptiles and amphibians, it's the original material with a glass eyeball, but then they just put like a weird kind of like shellac or kind of varnish clear coating on the outside of it to make it look like it's still wet. All right, so you know all these hazards, you know it's dirty, so now what are you going to do? The first thing you're going to do is prepare your workspace. So talk about what we've set up, what we've already been talking about, you know, wear your PPE, you know, clear away everything, and gather supports to make sure that the specimen's going to be supported once you put it down. Especially if it's a bighorn sheep and you put it on the table, it's going to be a little top heavy. So you're going to want to have different padding materials like foam and blankets and maybe even weights that you can support the taxidermy in different ways when you set it down. You want to examine it before you move it and figure out exactly where you want to pick it up. If it's already on a base, on a display base, like in this image, then you just move it by the base. You don't want to move it by the actual, by touching the actual specimen. The only time that I would do that is if it was something that was removed from a diorama and I haven't put it in the little ethafoam yet, haven't stuck the wires in yet. So if that were the case, then I would handle it most likely by the torso, by like the broadest area possible. You want to gather your supplies. So these are the supplies on this page that I always have in my cleaning kit when I do any kind of cleaning for art conservation. I have my non-cotton gloves. We do nitrile gloves, but people also like latex gloves. So I think it depends on your preference. I have my particle mask and I have my respirator on hand if I need to. You don't see in this image, but I'll have my lab coat. I have plastic sheeting that I can put down to cover my workspace, and I can have that to protect everything and keep everything contained. I have my HEPA vacuum with a screen covering. So sometimes I will use a micro attachment, which you see in the image, or sometimes I'll just use the regular nozzle of the vacuum. So you can have either, but you want to have a little piece of soft screen or cheesecloth to put over top of it so that you don't risk, if something does become loose inadvertently and it wants to get sucked up by the vacuum, the screen will prevent it from being sucked up and lost. And then I also have my soft bristle paint brushes. And for taxidermy specifically, I like using fan brushes because that shape is especially nice for fluffing fur and for positioning feathers or getting in between feathers. And then these are extra supplies. If you're also feeling like you can clean the eyes, the beaks, and the talons, then you should have a little container of distilled water, and you want to label the container water, and you want to have cotton swabs or Q-tips, because that's what you'll need for that. And then finally, additional cleaning on things like antlers, horns, and the plain wooden bases. You're going to use cosmetic sponges, which you can get, at a beauty store or pharmacy, whatever, and microfiber cloth. Which I hope you all have in your cleaning kit already. Microfiber cloths I just use for so many materials. That's what I use to wipe down our historic wooden furniture and my furniture at home. I use it on ceramics and glass, and it's my kind of like Swiss Army knife of dusting material. So I did this little recording for you all so you could see what it looks like. This is like the number one thing. I know it's people are probably like, oh yeah, vacuuming, like I know how to do that. But for specifically for museum objects, you'll notice that I'm holding the vacuum nozzle that has the screen on it, or you could use cheesecloth. I'm holding it above the specimen. I'm not, putting it directly onto the top of the surface. I'm holding it parallel, and I am pushing the paintbrush. I'm pushing the dust kind of like into the vacuum. And for this one, like you see, I'm getting the feathers like a little bit out of alignment just to kind of make sure that I get the dust in there. And then after I do that, without the vacuum on, then I can come back through with my brush and I can kind of preen them using the same brush and like getting in between and putting them back into arrangement. You want to brush any kind of taxidermy animal the way in the direction that the hair or the feather grows, just so that you don't risk getting anything out of position. like the amount that I'm brushing on here and kind of getting them out of alignment is probably as far as you would want to go, especially on historic pieces. If you manhandle it a little too much, then you risk pulling out feathers or pulling out hairs. On the next one, okay, this is my favorite thing to do. This cleaning the eyeballs is what really adds kind of the life back to the taxidermy mounts. It's surprising how big of a difference it makes. So first you want to do your brush and vacuum. Then you take your cotton swab and or your Q-tip and you dip it very briefly into the distilled water. You tamp off any excess water to make sure that it's just dampened and not dripping. You don't want to get any water around the eyelids or any other places, because especially for these historic ones, that eyelid is very, very thin skin. And if you slip and you go onto the eyelid, chances are you're going to end up damaging that skin and have some loss. So you just take your cotton swab and you gently roll it around. You'll notice in this video that I'm holding the back of the head. I'm kind of holding onto the head to prevent excessive movement of it, because that skin's very thin. We don't want the head popping off. And hopefully you can tell in this image like how careful I'm being on this piece. Some newer taxidermy might be more robust, mammals might be more robust, but always approach something with like a gentle touch first. After I use the wet cotton swab, then I go over it again a second time, but I use a dry cotton swab, and that just kind of, takes off the moisture so that we don't get weird drying lines, but then also kind of like buffs it a little bit and just really make. And you can do the same. You can repeat these processes or repeat the process on the beak and on the talons, so on like the harder surfaces of these animals. But just be careful that there aren't paint layers that you risk taking off during this. And here you see an example for larger animals. For the mammals, you can use larger brushes. I'm using a larger brush in this, but you can still see that I'm positioning the vacuum away from the animal and I'm brushing the dust into it. And the cotton swab technique on the eyeballs, the cotton swab on the left is the dirty one, the wet one, and then the one on the right is the one that I use to buff it out afterwards. And then finally, for cleaning antlers, horns, and wooden bases, so they're those hard materials, especially for mammals. First, you want to brush and vacuum, and then you can take your cosmetic sponges and wipe them using steady pressure. I like to wipe in one direction because you're not scrubbing the surface, you're just wiping it. And I will hold on to one of the antler tines to keep it in position, so I don't risk moving around the specimen very much. And for some of the more textured areas, especially towards the base of antlers, you could get in there and further clean them with more of a stiff bristle paintbrush. So not the fan brush, but you might want to get one that's a little bit shorter and kind of stubby that can allow you to get in between things. And for if you have a habitat base, or like a diorama or whatnot, I'm really going to say you should really, really be careful and only clean those if you know that they're stable. If it's dried plant material, that can be very risky to touch and they'll just kind of crumble. But if it's a fake plant material, test it discreetly, very gently first, and see if you can brush that. And here you can see there's some also soot sponges that you can use on these harder components, especially if you have smoke damage. But I wouldn't recommend using them on the hair unless you have guidance of a conservator, because you really risk, like, they kind of pull on surfaces, which makes them so great for cleaning off the soot. But if you're doing that on hair, you really risk the hair coming out as well. And you can see me using the microfiber cloth on the antler. So if you have some newer pieces of taxidermy that you've cleaned before and you know that the hair is secure, you could even do a very gentle wipe with the microfiber cloth, like once a week or something. Not once a week, maybe more like once a month. And then when you're finished cleaning, you want to vacuum all of the brushes that you use so that if there are any arsenic particles on them, you don't risk flinging those around somewhere else. So vacuum the brushes, vacuum your surface, You can wipe the surface with a wet disposable cloth wipe, like a Lysol wipe or something. I just recently heard a talk where they did a little bit of testing and they did find that to be a little somewhat successful. So go ahead and do that. I like to save the plastic for sustainability. So then fold the plastic in on itself after you vacuumed it and then save it for future use in a designated bag. Throw away your sponges and your wipes in a designated trash bag and fold your gloves in on themselves and then throw them away in a designated trash bag as well. And if you can, I hold on to these trash bags. So for my routine cleaning, so that I'm not contributing to hazardous waste. And then once it gets full, then I would contact the necessary people to dispose of your hazardous waste. You're gonna have to just, if different states, different cities have different laws on that. So you'll have to do some investigation on how you dispose of things that are contaminated with arsenic. Okay, here's your warning from a conservator. Here's your warning. Don't attempt to clean using wet methods. I'm not getting into that in this because you really do have to know your collection a little bit better. This is a moose where the ear on the right was cleaned using wet methods and the person did not do it correctly and they didn't know that there was, I think there was really embedded soiling in the ear and then also maybe even another type of coating on there. And it just, that matted look took me a long time to reverse and to make it look a little bit more like the one on the left, but I still wasn't even like fully successful with it. So I really think that you should only stick to dry cleaning methods. And also very important, everyone listen to this, beware of hollow hairs. So mammals that come from cold climates have hollow guard hairs, which help keep them warm in these climates, but they're also notorious for just like popping off and crunching and creating bald spots. So be very careful if you're treating caribou, reindeer, bighorn sheep, antelope. They're the hair on their butts, that's hollow guard hair. So just be very careful when you're treating different animals that, well, the antelope don't live really in colder climates, but especially if it's colder climates, and test on a discrete area first before you proceed, but also be aware that some areas might have different types of hair or might be more fragile than others. So even if you test out an area and it seems okay, when you're moving around the specimen, continue to watch it and continue to look at your screen. And if it starts to be full of a lot of hair, then you should stop and maybe just hover the vacuum over top, not touch it with a brush, but like hover a few inches away so that any like really loose dust that's on the top of the surface will come up, but hopefully the hair won't. And then I'm sure, I imagine that most people here know about preventive measures. I'm just going to briefly talk about what is important for taxidermy. For storing it, it's really great to have them in enclosed cabinets in their original position. So if it was on a display base upright, like a little bird, you don't want to store it over on its side because you don't want it to rest on its fragile, thin skin. You want to keep it upright. You can use additional supports. If you can't store it that way, just make sure that you really pad it out to be as comfortable as possible. And if their specimens are large, you can store them covered, in the middle of your floor with plastic or tieback for protection, and hang the shoulder mounts on a wall in the same way that you would have them on display. But you need to be careful when you cover things with plastic that you don't crush the ears, that you don't crush the fur. Keep in mind those really fragile areas. Even crushed hair sometimes is very difficult to fluff back up. And I want to point out there were a couple of people who were talking about fire damage, or not so much fire damage, but in areas, I believe, where some wildfires happen, and they wanted to know how to further protect their specimens from that. And the most important thing would be the museum envelope, making sure that everything has, doors have seals around them, everything's gasketed. Hopefully your windows are nice and sealed as well, so that the space can't be penetrated by smoke that's in the air. But don't worry, y'all, I know that like not everybody has those dream situations. If it's taxidermy that's on display and you can't cover it to protect it from smoke, let's say in like the fire season, then I think what you should do is vacuum the room that the taxidermy is in immediately after an event. If a big, smoke cloud just came through town for a few days, definitely vacuum during that time. Immediately after the event, but also during fire season, just ramp up your housekeeping, ramp up your vacuuming of that entire room and do it on a more regular basis. Like I'd even say once a week. And that's because, you know, some stuff's going to go ahead and deposit on the specimens, but a lot of things, you know, are going to be on the ground and on surfaces, and they're just going to be kicked up as people are walking through those spaces. And so it's like more opportunity for stuff to be deposited onto the taxidermy. So just ramp up your housekeeping on that. And also for those of you who ask those questions, please do email me if I'd like to learn more about what your challenges are so I can really tailor my responses. And so when I was saying that you don't want to crush things with your covering, here's a really good example of what you should do. You should make enclosures around them. If you don't know about stash, then oh boy, you gotta visit this as soon as this is done. Storage techniques for art, science, and history, and it gives a lot of recommendations on storage housing that you can do, and gives materials to buy, step-by-step instructions, and images. And anyone at any time can contribute to it as well. So if you have a really great tip, then you can throw it in there too. So you see this beaver, it's encased in Tyvek. Just make sure that you then end up peeking in on your specimens to make sure you don't have any pest activity. Here's a really good example from Stash on what to do with these odd shaped taxidermy pieces. So these birds were you know, taken off display, and when they're on these branches, but they don't have anything else to support them. So this particular entry in Stash talks about, you know, the materials on what to gather and like how to make ethafoam mounts for them to be able to display it, to store them safely. And here's another, well, an example from Yellowstone. And they took that even further. This is a heron, which once they took it off display, it was really top heavy because of some damage at the feet. So they had to create this ethafoam padded sling that's attached to a larger ethafoam column. And it was really great. They were able to move blocks around. So you can really get creative with the ethafoam that you have. And then when this is more for at home, if you're displaying it, just, you know, avoid places that might have a lot of moisture or a lot of heat. If you have a piece of taxidermy in the basement, as usual, you know, store it off the floor. Don't store it directly under a water pipe. Don't store things above a fireplace, or don't display them, I mean, above a fireplace. Basically what I do is I always think about your grandmother or someone who you really respect in your family, and you're not going to have that person, you know, you want to have them as comfortable as possible. So you're not going to put them, you know, you're not going to sit grandma like right above the stove or right above the fireplace, because those places get too hot, and you don't want her to be in a dank basement because that's just gross and kind of moldy. So display and store your taxidermy at home in a nice place with like the most stable environment and less light damage, less like not in front of a direct window. And then for the pests, hopefully you all have a robust IPM program specifically for taxidermy. It's the larvae that are the eaters. And these are the 3 specimens that I see the most on taxidermy collections. So you really want to inspect them to look for any examples of these larvae. So I'm looking, you know, I'd say every quarter, peek at your collections, or, you know, come up with some kind of routine that you do just for a visual assessment. So, you know, pull up the dust covers and look inside and see, like, do you see any shed casings on there, like those odd beetle casings? Do you see any shed casings on the base? So like, is it down below because it's fallen down after it's been cast off? Also look for any disturbed hairs or feathers like we saw in those examples earlier, because if you start to see some hairs being disrupted or some feathers coming off, then that's most likely a sign that you have some pest damage on that. So if you're not, if you don't know about the website museumpest.net yet, then you must check that out. And they have a lot of great resources, and there's a pest list, a distribution list that you could be part of. So if you need any help troubleshooting an issue, there are lots of folks on there with experience who can help you with that. And finally, the additional resources that I wanted to point out, if you do need help with wet recovery of taxidermy. If you've had a water event happen in your space, like a pipe bursting or some flooding or whatever has happened. I gave a talk back in 2018 with a colleague of mine from the American Museum of Natural History, and a recording of that is online on the AIC and FAIC YouTube channel. So you can check that out. And while you're there, also check out the other videos that they have to offer. That's now the home of the Connecting to Collection Care videos. And there are just a wide variety of topics there, including another one on taxidermy that some other folks led. It wasn't me, so you'll get even different perspectives and different information. And they also have another a talk on some hazards and collections as well, but a huge variety of things, not just natural history. And finally, my final plug is that the upcoming 5th edition of Basic Condition Reporting, published by the Southeastern Registrars Association, is going to include a chapter on taxidermy. And I was the one who wrote that one. So it's going to be a lot of the examples today, but even different photographs of examples. I tried to include as many as possible. I surprisingly didn't get in trouble, but so you can just see what it looks like, different types of damage, or just learn a little bit more about how to condition report on these. So thank you. I think I probably have eaten into question time, but I just want to say cleaning is really important. Once again, say that to you. You can see the difference in the primate before cleaning on the left and after cleaning on the right. So even something as simple as cleaning can really add a lot of life back to your taxidermy. So I hope you go out and do it.
Thank you so much, Fran. I like that
so much.
So let's
I still see a lot of people are on, so thanks for sticking around, everyone. Oh my goodness.
We do have a few questions that hopefully we have a few minutes we can get to, and there's first just one that I'm going to answer real quick. Maeve asked if the PowerPoint is going to be shared. So our RCWR, Registrars Committee Western Region YouTube page has all of our presentations. So not only the amazing PowerPoint, but Fran's content, which just adds so much more to that. So go online, either to our website under the workshops tab or to our YouTube page, and you'll be able to find that in just a few days. It takes us a little bit. We're a volunteer board to get it edited down so you don't have me just sitting around waiting for 10 o'clock. But now back to the more important questions. We did have a few that came in that were about the periodicity of cleaning. So do you have a regular time frame for cleaning taxidermy, or is it case by case dependent in a location such as in storage, exhibit, or possibly even region?
You're exactly right. So what this image that you see on the screen now, this was a highly trafficked open display portion of the museum. So these primates had to be cleaned at least twice a year, and even twice a year, they were this filthy every time. So like we really ideally should have cleaned them 4 times a year, but it just never seemed to quite work out that way. So if things are on open display and you visibly start to see dust accumulation, just remember that. And then you can, over time, you can log that in and say, oh yeah, I know that our exhibit during the summertime when we received the most traffic, we're really starting to see dust accumulation on things. So I'm going to clean those specimens, once a month or something like that for just the months of summer. So I would say you might have to, do some investigation on your own for those. But for things in storage, if you're taking something off of exhibit and putting it onto storage, please clean it before you put it into storage. And then once it's there, as long as you don't notice a dust accumulation or you don't usually have that issue in storage, then I'd say you might not even really need to clean it again for several years, but just keep an eye on it. And then for if you are having more something unusual happening like those fires, if it's fire season, then clean the room more frequently. If you just have that big, if there's smoke above you and the air quality is very poor, clean the room once a week at least. And then I'd say clean the taxidermy if it's really bad. And I'm sorry, I'm from the East, so I don't know this quite as well, but if it's really bad, I would say maybe even clean the taxidermy then every 2 weeks or at least once a month during that really bad portion. And once again, email me if you want to bounce some ideas.
We definitely have more experience out west for our members with dealing with fire season. So I'll also suggest referencing back to Rosa Lowenger's presentation about cleaning items with soot, uh, a little bit more for outdoor sculpture where things are getting directly impacted, but there was some great information in that. We have a question here from Angela because her museum doesn't have a conservator on staff and she has trouble finding conservators who will work with items contaminated with arsenic. They have items for clothing, buckskin, and wool textiles that need conservation. Do you have a resource that can help find conservators that will specifically work with this? Because AIC's tool doesn't.
Yeah, that is such an interesting point. I know that if AIC hasn't already done a little bit more of a revamp of their Find a Conservator, I know that they're trying to make the tool better. And I could actually suggest that to them, that could be like another tick box so that you'll know right off the bat. Because unfortunately, like I don't know of like a specific resource like that. What I do know are conservators who do work on these types of materials. So I could even share some of those lists. I think it's going to be another of like that person might just want to email me and I can give some recommendations. There is the Society for Preservation of Natural History Collections. And I'm a co-chair of the conservation committee there. And I believe that the conservation committee is listed on the website. So you at least get to see a list of folks who are interested in these types of topics. The conservation committee isn't necessarily conservators, but you can maybe even start there too and see some conservators there. But thank you for pointing that out. And I'll email AIC and see if that's something that we could add to it.
See, now we're giving back to AIC by having you come and help us. With these collections, we have a question from Lorraine asking if there's a date after which we can safely assume arsenic wasn't used or any of those other toxic fumigants we're talking about.
Yeah. So I generally think in the 60s. Very fluid though. So if I encounter an object that was mounted in the 60s, I feel like it's a 50-50 chance where like there's a good chance that it won't have arsenic and there's a good chance that it will. I think that that's when, more regulations were starting to happen and people became more concerned about health and safety and also environmental safety, like DDT. Actually, I can't remember when DDT was banned, but like we started to finally like have those big swings and like changes in thought on this type of thing. So 60s is when I'm like, okay. And then just like more recently, like the less I'm concerned, but that does not mean that people are not still using pesticides on their taxidermy. So, and I don't even know if a taxidermist would really even tell you that, but hopefully they would. So if anyone ever does, like if someone wants to donate a new mount or something to the museum, and let's say it's an animal that is endemic to your area and you're interested in taking it, I would hope you to ask the taxidermist whether or not they used it. But if you have a collection prior to 1960s, then be more wary.
And we did have a question in here. Someone commented that they'd heard it's possible to borrow or rent XRF readers from other entities, and they asked universities and other museums. And if you had any tips or thoughts about this. I've definitely heard of this process from universities.
Yes, definitely reach out to your network. So I do have thoughts on this. The main Bruker representative for years and years, his name was Bruce Kaiser. And every time I took a training with him, he was very adamant that like, yes, if you ever want to borrow one of our instruments, like just contact us, like we'll come out and do that. So definitely even contact, the actual like manufacturers of XRF instruments to see if they're still providing that service, because I think it just makes them look good. And then they'll also maybe entice you to buy one kind of thing, put it on your wish list. I have also partnered up with universities, a lot of chemistry labs, archaeology labs, people who are looking into soil sampling and like wanting to do measurements on soils. So those are good places, certainly museums. I know even like in my capacity, a park was interested in accessioning some taxidermy pieces. So a person swung by here and I just ran out into the parking lot and like did some XRF and then ran back in. So I think that places are open to doing that because it doesn't take very long. It's not much resource that they need to worry about. So my thought on it though is that you need to be careful that if you are, and there are places that will rent units. So I was helping out on a project just 2 months ago, and we wanted to rent an XRF, and we had a really difficult time doing it because of supply shortages that are happening right now. And the exact one that we wanted wasn't available. So they're like, here, try this one. So we're zapping everything. I'm like, this one looks really suspicious. Like this piece of taxidermy, you said it's from the 1880s and it's saying that it doesn't have arsenic. Like I'm very concerned with this. So we were scrounging around the collection for a known positive arsenic. So we were looking for, arsenic that like people would have been ingesting, and unfortunately or fortunately like didn't find it. So I was like, this is really suspicious. So instead what I did is took swabs, samples, bagged them, and then brought them back to my lab, and I used my XRF to test for arsenic. And sure enough, about half the samples had arsenic and one even had mercury on it, but the XRF we borrowed didn't show that. And it's because it wasn't set to the proper parameters. So if you're going to be renting a machine or even borrowing one from someone, make sure that it will detect arsenic, lead, and mercury.
Always good to let people know what you're expecting technology to do.
Yeah.
Keith asked, would you clean natural bone items like skulls with the same methods as the antlers and horns, or would it be more like the eyeballs, talons, and beaks?
Both for those. Yeah. So I would start with, I try to remove everything that's loose first. So I would start with brush and vacuum. Then I would do cosmetic sponge or microfiber cloth. And then I would even, if it seemed like it was pretty dirty, then I would use a very lightly dampened cotton swab. I wouldn't do that. I would avoid the teeth. Don't do that because they're so susceptible to breaking and delaminating. And if you introduce, like they're already kind of on the brink, I feel. And so if you're introducing more water to them, that could be detrimental. But for the rest of it, I would imagine it would be okay. Sometimes bone material it's oily if it wasn't prepared properly the first time. So beware that there might be some sticky, oily patches. And then also beware that if it wasn't prepared properly, it also might be too dry. So you might be seeing some delamination of the bone, or you might be seeing some kind of crumbly areas. So still inspect it, look out for those places, but for the most part, you should be okay with a lightly dampened cotton swab.
And I apologize, there are so many great questions in here, but I'll do 2 more that have come in. But if you have further questions, we'll put Fran's email address back up on the screen. And please note, I'm trying to hit the questions that are reappearing over and over again. So if your question isn't asked, it's not because it's not a great question. But so I've got Joanna here asking about the safe ways to repair a detached tail. And she specifically has a historic fur blanket pelt. And so she researched a method online that involved inserting a piece of wire and then reattaching with a wheat starch or wheat paste adhesive. Does this sound feasible? And there were a few other questions about adhesives and reattaching.
No, I wouldn't use wheat starch paste because it's not flexible. So depending on what the tail is, so so send me a photo of this and see, but well, read that again, Beth. Read the first part again, because is the tail metal going into mannequin and she wants to secure the metal of the wire into the mannequin, or is she trying to adhere skin to skin? Hold on, you're muted.
Forgot to unmute myself. Yeah. Hers is on a fur blanket, pelt blanket. So not.
Yeah. So I mean, wheat starch paste is a good adhesive. It ages well over time. It's what paper conservators use a lot. It's really nice because it's strong, but it's reversible in water. But the reason why I wouldn't really like to do it or use it on that type of object is because it's not flexible. I feel like you'd probably want a little bit of, movement, but, especially if it's not a collection piece, then I'd be more willing to say, give it a try. What's tough with these objects too, is that there's very little surface area left. So when you're repairing something, you don't really just do butt joins. You have to have a lining material, and that lining material also has to be flexible, strong, but not too strong, sympathetic to the original material. Like, you don't want your lining material to be so strong that if something happens, then it ends up ripping the fragile skin. So these are all the types of considerations that I think about. But if this isn't a collection piece, then and you end up playing around with it, then I will never know.
And we had a comment in the chat from Efrat that wheat starch can also be yummy to new pests sometimes.
Yeah, exactly. Just bringing in more stuff that they would enjoy. Yeah, I tend to use synthetic adhesives because they're flexible, and a little bit because of they're less inviting to pests.
And then, in the spirit of continued education, I'll do the last question from Julia, asking if you know of any university courses or programs that are focused on taxidermy conservation. She's in Europe, so that would be her preference, but generally.
Yeah, no, we don't. My training is that I went to one of the very few programs in North America specifically for art conservation, went to Buffalo State College, and that teaches you conservation of paintings, paper, and objects. And then, since I'm an objects conservator, I specialized in that. And then I took it even further, just of my own interest. So we didn't specifically in class learn this. It's just that I already had experience prior to graduate school working on these collections. And then I tailored some of my experiences and research to go towards this field. But there is a lot more. And all the other graduate programs are just like that, where if someone has an interest, it's because it's been their personal interest. So for those of us in North America who have been working on natural history collections, I'd say, like, a lot of us we network within the Society for Preservation of Natural History Collections. And I would recommend that person look for different workshops and different things happening through that. I don't think that there are very many that are online, but every other year, the Society for Preservation of Natural History Collections has a meeting that's outside of the United States. So this coming June, it's going to be in Edinburgh, Scotland. And I know that there will be some workshops there, and they're often hands-on workshops. I'm doing another one on cleaning your collections, but not just taxidermy, like a much larger scope, including like archival materials and things like that. So I'd look to those. I will say I know of some programs in the UK that I'm not very thrilled about, which I could personally email about. And then also, like, I think there might be some more opportunities are going to be happening in the United States in the upcoming years, but those are some things that are still kind of cooking that I've heard rumors of. But for now, I would look into Society for Preservation of Natural History Collections.
Well, thank you again. Thank you so much, Fran. And thank you all for joining us this morning, afternoon, evening, or night, and asking questions and being involved. I'm going to pull my screen back up real quick. And just let you know that we've enjoyed these conservation webinars so much, but we decided it was time to go back to basics. And so our next series beginning in February is going to be Back to Basics, Collections and a Cocktail. So there'll be more information coming about that soon. So please check your email if you're an RCWR member to be first to sign up for those. They're going to be a lot of fun. The cocktail is BYO, I apologize. But our first topic is going to be pest management. So we'll just keep following on each one leading into the next talk that we have. And so we're going to make these fun and a little bit more interactive too. So please stay tuned. I'll post all the information on our normal channels and share it through Facebook. So however you found about this one, go back to there. We hope you enjoyed today's webinar. It will be up on our YouTube page in just a few days. So go back there to reference if you missed something in the presentation. And if you need to take a screenshot real quick to get my email address to ask any questions about RCWR or more more probable to get Fran's email address because there are still some great questions in the chat box, please don't hesitate to get in touch with either of us. And thank you so much for joining us. We enjoy having you here and we can't wait to see you next month.